Welcome, friends, and thank you for joining us tonight at Sleepy Tales of Lore for another yarn of myths and legends passed down through the ages. My name is Declan, and I will be your narrator for this first account in our special series of St. Patrick's Day sleep stories called The Cobbler of Carra Glen. This one is presented in a gentle and contemplated tempo filled with Irish folklore, related in a soft, soothing voice that will put you into a relaxing, deep sleep quickly. After you enjoy this one, please subscribe to our channel to be notified when the next story posts in this series, as we celebrate the lore of leprechauns, shamrocks, and all things St. Patrick's Day. Now, get comfy and let go of all the worries of the day as our story begins. Now there was once a leprechaun, the oldest leprechaun in all of County Mayo, some said, who lived alone beneath the roots of a great hawthorn tree at the edge of the valley they called Carra Glen. His name was Pádraig, though he had not been called by that name in so many years that he had almost forgotten the sound of it. Most knew him only as the Cobbler, and most knew better than to go looking for him. The hawthorn tree stood on a rise above a slow-moving stream, its trunk so old and so thick that two men could not have wrapped their arms around it. Its roots spread wide and deep into the hillside, arching up from the dark earth in great curved ridges before plunging back down again, and in the largest of the spaces between those roots, in a hollow so perfectly shaped that it might have been carved by a craftsman's hand, sat the entrance to his workshop, a low door of darkened wood, no taller than a man's knee, iron-hinged, very old. The glen around it was quiet in the way that only certain places in Ireland are quiet. A deep quiet, a quiet with weight and age in it, the kind that settles into the bones of a place over centuries and becomes part of its very nature. The stream moved slowly below, talking to itself over smooth stones in a voice barely above a murmur. The grass was long and very green on either bank, and if you stood still long enough in that glen on a quiet evening, still enough and quiet enough, you might just hear it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of a small hammer on a small last, coming from somewhere beneath the roots of the old hawthorn, steady and unhurried as a heartbeat. Inside the workshop, the world was very small and very warm. The ceiling was low, the underside of great tangled roots, hung here and there with bundles of dried herbs and loops of waxed thread. The walls were the living earth itself, packed smooth over long years of habitation, and set into them at intervals were shallow shelves cut directly from the soil, each one holding its careful arrangement of tools and materials, awls and needles of varying sizes, rolls of leather in every shade from pale cream to deepest brown, tins of beeswax polish worn smooth around their edges from the touch of the same hands over many, many years, and shoes, everywhere shoes, in various states of completion, arranged along every available surface with the quiet order of a man who knows exactly where everything is and requires it to remain precisely there. A single lantern hung from a root above his workbench, casting a circle of amber light over the surface where he worked. And within that circle of light sat Pádraig himself, the Cobbler of Carra Glen. He was small, even by leprechaun standards, lean and slightly stooped from decades of bending over his work, his white beard neatly kept, his green coat worn soft with age at the elbows. His hands, The hands of a craftsman who had been at his craft longer than most things in the county had been alive. Moved over the shoe in his lap with a certainty so complete it had long since ceased to require any conscious thought at all. Tap, tap, tap. He was not, it must be said, what most people expected when they imagined a leprechaun. There was no gleam of mischief in his eye, no readiness to vanish in a puff of clever distraction. He was old in a way that had moved beyond all of that, beyond cleverness and beyond tricks, beyond the need to be anything other than what he was. What he was a cobbler, the finest cobbler. It was quietly understood among those who knew of such things, in the whole of the west of Ireland. And on this particular evening, as the light outside the little door grew long and golden with the last of the autumn sun, he was working on a pair of shoes that were, even by his own considerable standards, extraordinary. Now, a leprechaun's shoes are not made the way a human cobbler makes shoes. That much most people in the west of Ireland could have told you, even those who had never seen a leprechaun in their lives and were not entirely certain they believed in them. It was simply known. The way certain things are known in a place that has held its stories long enough for them to settle into the ground itself. The way knowledge of the tides is known by people who have lived beside the sea for generations. Not learned, simply there. A leprechaun's shoes begin, as all truly important things begin, with the choosing of the leather. Not any leather will do, not even any good leather. The leather for a leprechaun's shoe must come from a hide that has been cured slowly, over the course of a full turning of the moon, in a mixture that Pádraig had been refining for so long that the recipe existed nowhere but in his hands, in the particular pressure of his fingers and the particular judgment of his nose and the particular quality of attention he brought to the checking of it each morning before the light had fully come into the sky. The result, when it was right, and it was always right, because Pádraig did not proceed until it was a leather of such suppleness and such strength that it moved with the foot inside it like a second skin, like something grown rather than made. But the shoes on his bench this evening were something beyond even that. He had been working on them for, well, he did not like to count the months. The leather had been chosen from a piece he had been keeping at the back of his deepest shelf for longer than he cared to say, wrapped in cloth of undyed wool and set aside for a purpose he had not yet known when he set it aside, only knowing with the certainty that came to him sometimes, the deep and wordless certainty of a craftsman whose instincts had been honed over centuries, that it was being kept for something that would, in time, make itself known. The shoes were small, smaller than his own, which were not large to begin with. They were built on a last he had carved himself from a piece of bog oak, that deep, almost black wood that comes out of the Irish bogs, having lain there for thousands of years, harder than almost anything that grows above the ground. The last had taken him 3 weeks to carve, working by lantern light in the evenings when the day's regular work was done, shaping it with a patience and a precision that even he, a patient and precise man by any measure, had found remarkable in himself. When it was finished, he had held it in both hands in the lamplight for a long time, turning it slowly, examining it from every angle. It was, perfect. And that word was not one he used lightly or often. The upper of the shoe was nearly complete now. The stitching, done with thread he had waxed himself from a beeswax block given to him a very long time ago by a woman who kept bees on the sunny side of a hill in Connemara, ran in lines so even and so fine that you might have thought them the work of something mechanical rather than human, or rather, not human. Because that was the truth of it, of course. There was nothing mechanical about them at all. Each stitch had been placed with full and individual attention, with the consideration of a mind that had done this particular thing so many thousands of times that it had become not labor but something closer to breathing, something closer to thinking. Along the edge of the upper, worked into the leather itself in a technique that had no name in any human language, was a pattern, not stamped or carved, but coaxed, somehow, from the grain of the leather itself, the way a particularly skilled hand can coax music from an instrument that a lesser player would render merely, loud. The pattern was of leaves, small, precise, each one different from the last. The way leaves on an actual tree are each different from the last, if you look closely enough and long enough to notice. Hawthorn leaves, of course. Pádraig set his hammer down on the bench beside him and held the unfinished shoe up in the lamplight, turning it slowly in his fingers. The leather caught the amber glow and held it in the way that only the very finest leather does, not reflecting it back sharply, but absorbing it, warming it, giving it back to the room in a softer and more beautiful form than it had arrived in. He turned it once more, then again. Then he set it back down on the bench with the care of a man setting down something irreplaceable, which was, in every sense that mattered, exactly what it was. Outside, the light in the glen had shifted. The gold of the late afternoon had deepened toward the amber of early evening, and the shadows of the hawthorn's branches had grown long across the grass. The stream continued its quiet conversation with itself over the stones below. A blackbird somewhere in the upper branches of a nearby ash tree sang 4 notes, unhurried, unfinished, as if merely testing the quality of the evening air, and then fell silent. The glen settled. The lantern light in the little workshop beneath the roots glowed on, steady and warm and entirely undisturbed. For now. The village of Carra sat on the high ground above the glen, a small and unremarkable collection of whitewashed cottages arranged along a single road that wound up from the valley floor like a thought that hadn't quite made up its mind where it was going. It was the kind of village that appeared on no map of any importance, and the people who lived there were, on the whole, quietly content with that arrangement. They knew their own land, they knew their own sky, and they knew, in that same unhurried way that they knew most things, to stay well clear of Carra Glen after the light began to go. It was not that anything bad had ever happened in the glen. That was not the concern. The concern was more subtle than that. The glen had a quality to it, particularly in the evening hours, that the older people in the village described, when they described it at all, as a feeling of being watched. Not threateningly, not unkindly, simply watched. The way you might feel watched in an old church when you believed yourself alone in it, or in a wood that has been standing so long it has developed opinions. Most people found this feeling reason enough to be home before dark. Most people, but not all. Bridget Flannery was 18 years old, the youngest daughter of the schoolmaster, and she had been warned about the Glen since she was old enough to understand warnings. She had listened to those warnings with the polite and patient attention of a girl who had already, very quietly, decided that she would one day see the Glen for herself. Not out of recklessness. Bridget was not a reckless girl. She was, in the words of her father, who observed her with the fond bewilderment of a man who had expected something more straightforward, thoughtful, dangerously, beautifully, unstoppably thoughtful. She had set out from the village that afternoon with the stated intention of gathering late blackberries from the hedgerows on the eastern slope, which was perfectly true, as far as it went. The basket on her arm was evidence of it. What she had not mentioned, to her father, or to her sisters, or to anyone else, was that the eastern slope happened to lie directly above Carra Glen, and that she had chosen it with this fact very clearly in mind. She had gathered her blackberries. She had filled the basket almost to its brim, and then, with the basket set carefully in the shade of a hazel bush and her eyes on the valley below, she had begun, very slowly and very deliberately, to make her way down. The slope was steeper than it looked from above. The grass was long and slightly damp from the previous night's rain, and her boots, good boots, her best ones, which she had worn partly out of vanity and partly out of some instinct that the Glen deserved to be visited in one's best, slipped twice on the wet grass before she found her footing on a sheep track that wound down between outcroppings of pale limestone. The track was narrow and old, older, she felt, than sheep. She followed it without hesitation, a hand trailing along the rough surface of the limestone beside her, cool and solid beneath her fingers. The change, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no sudden deepening of shadow, no chill on the air, none of the theatrical signals that the stories always promised. It was simply quieter. The sounds of the world above, the distant bark of a dog from the village, the occasional cry of a gull riding the wind above the valley, faded behind her as she descended, the way sounds fade when you enter a room and close the door behind you. And what replaced them was the sound of the Glen itself, the stream, the faint movement of air through long grass, and, below and beneath all of it, so faint, she told herself at first, she was imagining it, a small, rhythmic, patient sound. Tap, tap, tap. Bridget stopped on the sheep track and stood very still. The evening air moved softly around her, carrying the scent of the stream and the dark earth and the faint sweetness of the hawthorn blossom that still clung to the air in this sheltered place long after it had finished elsewhere. She stood still and she listened, with the full and focused attention of someone who has been waiting without quite knowing it, for a very long time to hear precisely this. There it was again, below her, and to the left. Coming from the direction of the great hawthorn tree she could see now at the bottom of the slope, its wide and ancient canopy catching the last of the evening light in a shimmer of dark green and gold. She took one slow breath, and then she continued down. The hawthorn tree was larger than it had appeared from the slope above. That was the first thing Bridget noticed as she came to stand before it in the dimming light of the glen. From the hillside, it had looked impressive enough. Old and wide and deeply rooted in the way of trees that have been standing in one place since before anyone thought to take notice of them. But here, standing at its base with its canopy spreading above her in every direction like the vaulted ceiling of some living cathedral, it was something else entirely. It was immense, not merely in the physical sense, though it was certainly that. Immense in the way that very old things are immense, carrying a weight of years that you feel in your chest rather than measure with your eyes. A presence that asks, without asking, for a certain quality of stillness from anyone who comes to stand within its reach. Bridget gave it that stillness. She stood without moving, her hands loose at her sides, and she looked up into the branches above her where the last pale light of the evening filtered through the leaves in long, slowly shifting threads of green and gold. The bark of the trunk before her was deeply furrowed and dark with age and damp, covered in places with a thin grey-green lichen that spread across its surface in slow, patient territories. The roots that spread from its base were vast, arching up out of the earth in great ridges before plunging back down, creating between them a series of sheltered hollows and shadowed spaces that the fading light barely reached. And there, in the largest of those spaces, set so naturally into the curve of the roots that you might almost have missed it, might almost have taken it for nothing more than a shadow or a trick of the fading light, was the door. It was smaller than she had imagined, though she could not have said, until this moment, that she had imagined it at all. Dark wood, iron hinged, the surface of it worn smooth in the centre where countless small hands had pushed it open over what must have been. She calculated, looking at the depth of that worn place. A very great many years indeed. Around its frame, the rootwood had been worn smooth too, polished by long proximity to something warm and inhabited, the way the stones around a much-used hearth grow smooth and dark over generations of fires. It was, Bridget thought, the most real thing she had ever seen. More real than the village above her. More real, almost, than herself. The tapping had stopped. She had not noticed precisely when. Somewhere between her first sight of the door and this moment of standing before it with her heart beating with a steadiness she found, under the circumstances, rather admirable. The glen around her was very quiet now. The stream below murmured on regardless, as streams do, indifferent to the various dramas being conducted on their banks. The blackbird had long since finished its 4 inconclusive notes and retired for the evening. The light was nearly gone from the sky above the canopy, leaving only a deep, luminous blue that deepened even as she watched it, the first star appearing in it with the quiet confidence of something that has been there all along and has simply been waiting for the light to step aside. She should, she knew, go home. Her father would be wondering. Her sisters would be setting the table and calling her name up the lane in that particular tone they used when they already knew she had gone further than she had said she was going. She knew all of this. She considered it, genuinely and carefully, the way she considered most things. And then she looked back at the little dark door set into the root of the ancient hawthorn, and she crouched down in the grass before it, and she raised her hand. She knocked 3 times, quietly, with the knuckle of her right forefinger. The sound it made was surprisingly solid. The door was thicker than it looked, and the sound of her knock carried into whatever was beyond it with a clarity that suggested the space on the other side was not small. Silence followed. A long silence. Long enough that she began, very quietly, to feel slightly foolish. Long enough that she had time to notice that the grass beneath her knees was cold and damp, and that the evening air had taken on a chill that had not been in it an hour ago, and that the star she had spotted above the canopy had been joined now by 2 others. She waited, with the patience that was, her father had always said, with a mixture of pride and exasperation, her most formidable quality. And then, from somewhere beyond the dark wood of the little door, came a sound. Not the tapping this time. Something slower. Something that resolved itself as she held her breath and listened into the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Small ones. Unhurried. Growing. Very gradually. Closer. The door opened. Inward. Slowly, and without drama, and with the slight resistance of hinges that were perfectly maintained but had been turning in the same direction for a very long time and had, perhaps, formed their own quiet opinions about the matter. The amber light from within spilled out across the roots and the dark grass and the tops of Bridget's boots, warm and steady as the light from a cottage window on a winter evening. She did not move. She barely breathed. He was smaller than she had expected, which was, she immediately recognized, a somewhat foolish thing to have expected otherwise, given everything she had ever heard on the subject. He stood in the open doorway with his white-bearded chin at approximately the level of the door handle, his green coat open over a waistcoat of darker green, his pointed hat sitting slightly crooked on his head in the manner of something worn so habitually that its angle had ceased to register. His hands, remarkable hands, she noticed immediately, the hands of a man who had worked with them for longer than she could fathom, were folded loosely before him. He looked up at her. His eyes were, she would think about this later, lying awake in her own bed in the village above, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what lives beneath it. His eyes were the colour of the glen itself. Not any one colour exactly. Green and grey and something darker beneath both of those. Something that had the quality of deep water seen from above. You could tell there was depth there. Considerable depth, without being able to see the bottom of it. They were calm eyes, entirely, unhurriedly calm, and they were looking at her with an expression that contained— she searched for the word and found it— recognition. Not the recognition of someone who has met you before. Something older than that. The recognition of someone who has been expecting you, not tonight specifically, not in this particular form, but in the way that a door expects, eventually, to be knocked upon, in the way that a story expects, sooner or later, to find its listener. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The amber light from the workshop lay between them on the dark earth, and the sound of the stream below carried up through the still air of the glen, and somewhere high above the hawthorn canopy a late curlew sent its long, wavering cry across the darkening sky. That ancient sound, the sound of the Irish evening, the sound that carries in it all the open space and all the old sadness and all the unhurried beauty of this particular island on this particular edge of the world. It faded. The glen breathed. It was Pádraig who spoke first. His voice was not what she had expected either, though she could not have said what she had expected. It was low and unhurried, with the particular quality of a voice that has spoken carefully and selectively for a very long time and has learned, through long practice, to use no more words than a thing requires. And what he said was this: "You had better come in then." That was all. No surprise in it. No suspicion. No particular warmth, though not the absence of it either. Simply a statement of the next logical thing. As if a young woman from the village, kneeling in the damp grass before his door at the edge of full dark, was not precisely an everyday occurrence, but not entirely outside the range of things he had accounted for, somewhere in the long arithmetic of his years. Bridget looked at the door. It was, as she had noted, considerably smaller than she was. She looked back at Pádraig, who was watching her with those deep and patient eyes, and something in his expression, the faintest possible suggestion of amusement at the corners of it, like a fire that has burned so long it has learned to give warmth without giving light, told her not to worry about the question of dimensions. She was not, after all, in the glen of ordinary things anymore. She bent down. She placed her hands on the cool earth on either side of the door frame, and she went through. The workshop received her the way it received everything, without fuss, without comment, with the simple and complete hospitality of a space that has been warm and well kept for a very long time and has room, always, for one more. The smell of it reached her first, leather and beeswax and something smoky sweet she could not identify, and beneath all of those, the smell of the earth itself, deep and clean and permanent. Then the warmth. Then the light. That amber lantern glow falling over the workbench and the shelves and the careful rows of tools and materials with the evenness and the intimacy of light that has been illuminating the same space for so long it knows every corner of it by heart. She straightened. The ceiling was low but sufficient, and looked around her. And the sight of that small and perfect workshop, with its shelves of leather and its bundles of dried herbs and its rows of shoes in every stage of completion, produced in her chest a feeling she had no name for. Something between wonder and recognition, between the feeling of seeing something for the first time and the feeling of remembering something you had almost, but not quite, forgotten. Behind her, the little door swung quietly closed, and Pádraig, moving past her with the unhurried ease of a man in the only room he has ever needed, settled himself back onto his workbench stool, reached for the unfinished shoe, and picked up his hammer. Tap, tap, tap. Bridget stood for a moment in the center of the workshop, looking at the shelves, looking at the ceiling of interlaced roots above her, looking at the lantern turning its slow amber light across everything it could reach. Then she looked at the low stool that sat against the earth wall to her left. A small stool, but not a leprechaun small stool, which suggested, she thought, that she was not the first person of her approximate dimensions to have been invited in through that small dark door. She sat down on it carefully, folded her hands in her lap, and watched Pádraig work. He did not acknowledge her sitting. He did not acknowledge her presence at all, in any conventional sense. He simply worked. The hammer rose and fell with that same steady rhythm she had heard from the hillside above, each tap precisely placed, each one the product of a judgment so refined and so habitual that it required. She could see this clearly, watching his face, no conscious thought whatsoever. His expression was settled. That was the word for it. The expression of a man who has been, for a very long time, exactly where he wished to be, doing exactly what he wished to do, and has long since stopped being surprised by the satisfaction this brings him. Bridget waited. She was good at waiting. She had the kind of patience that is not really patience at all, not the effortful, teeth-gritted kind, but something more like genuine ease with the passage of time, a comfort with silence that most people of 18 do not yet possess and some people of 80 never manage. The workshop was warm. The lantern light was kind. The smell of leather and beeswax was, she discovered, one of the most deeply comfortable smells she had ever encountered. She felt her shoulders drop, the way shoulders drop when a room gives them permission. After a time, she could not have said how long, time having taken on, in this underground room, a quality quite different from its behavior above ground. Pádraig set his hammer down. He did not look up immediately. He turned the shoe in his hands once, examined a particular section of the stitching with the close attention of a man who trusts nothing, not even his own best work, without verification. Then he set the shoe down on the bench beside him, and he looked at her. "You have a question," he said. It was not quite a question itself. It was more an observation, stated with the mild certainty of someone pointing out that the sky had gone dark, or that the stream below was running. Bridget considered denying it, and then considered that this would be both dishonest and, in all likelihood, entirely transparent to a man who had been reading the faces of visitors for as long as this one clearly had. "I do," she said. Pádraig waited. "The shoes," Bridget said. She nodded toward the bench where the unfinished pair lay in the lamplight, their surfaces catching the amber glow in that extraordinary way she had noticed from the moment she entered, as if they were not merely reflecting the light, but somehow holding it. "They are different from the others." Pádraig looked at the shoes, then back at her. Something moved in those deep and quiet eyes. Not surprise. Nothing so simple as that. But something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who's been asked the right question, and is now engaged in the considerable internal task of deciding, slowly, and with full seriousness, how much of the answer to give. "They are," he said. Another silence. The lantern above the bench swayed the most infinitesimal degree in some unfelt current of air, and the light moved with it across the surface of the shoes, and the hawthorn leaf pattern worked into the leather, caught that moving light, and seemed, just for a moment, to shift and breathe as if the leaves themselves were stirred by a breeze that existed only there, only on the surface of that small and extraordinary piece of work. Bridget watched it and said nothing. "You noticed the pattern," Pádraig said. Again, not a question. "Hawthorn leaves," Bridget said, "like the tree above us." At this, something shifted in Pádraig's face. Not a smile, or not exactly a smile, but the movement of something in that direction, something that suggested that smiling was a thing he did very occasionally, and with great deliberateness, the way a careful craftsman uses his finest tools only when the work truly requires them. He looked at her for a long moment with those fathomless eyes. "Sit forward," he said then, "and I will tell you about the shoes." He reached for his hammer again, and for the shoe, and settled both in his lap with the ease of long habit. "It is not a short story," he added, as if this required mentioning. "I am not in a hurry," Bridget said. Pádraig looked at her once more over the shoe in his lap, a look that assessed and considered and arrived, in the space of a single slow breath, at some quiet conclusion, and then he nodded. Once. The way men like him nod when they have decided something, without flourish, without ceremony, with the simple finality of a door closing. Or, perhaps more accurately, opening. Tap, tap, tap. "It begins," said Pádraig, without looking up from his work. "A very long time ago, before this tree was a tree, before this glen had a name, before anyone living had any knowledge of it at all." He paused, turned the shoe, examined a stitch. "Before even me. There was a time," Pádraig said, without looking up from his work, "when the land of Ireland was different. not different in the way that land changes over the ordinary passage of years. The slow shifting of a coastline, the gradual filling of a lough, the patient encroachment of bog over what was once dry ground. Different in a deeper sense than that. Different in its quality. The way a room is different when someone remarkable is in it, as opposed to when it stands empty. The land, in those days, was full. He let that word rest in the warm air of the workshop for a moment. Full. Bridget did not ask him to explain it. She understood. In the way she was beginning to understand that she understood many things in this underground room that she would not have known how to say she understood before she entered it. Exactly what he meant. In those days, Pádraig continued, his hammer finding its rhythm again as he spoke. Tap, tap, tap. There were beings in this land that have no name now in any living language. Not the fairy folk, though the fairy folk were there too, going about their own considerable business. Not the leprechauns, though they were there as well, rather younger then and rather less settled in their ways than they would eventually become. These were older than any of those, older than the stories that were told about them. Even then, they were the first ones, the ones who had been here when the land itself was, learning what it was. They did not live in the ground, the way leprechauns do. They did not live in the trees or the water or the air, the way other beings of that ancient time made their homes. They lived between the ground and the air, between the water and the stone, between the seen world and whatever lies behind it, in the places where one thing is becoming another thing, and has not yet decided which it will be. Dawn, dusk, the edge of the tide, the moment before rain. These were their dwelling places. These were where they were, most themselves. Pádraig paused in his tapping. He reached across the bench for a small tin of wax, opened it with practiced fingers, drew a slow and careful line of it along a seam of the shoe with his thumbnail. The smell of it, warm and sweet and ancient, rose briefly in the air between them. One of them, he said, lived in this glen. Or, more precisely, in the space that would one day become this glen, when the land had finished deciding on its final shape. She, for she was a she, or at least the closest thing to a she that a being of that kind could be said to be, had been here since before the hawthorn tree was a seed, since before the stream below had found its course, since before the limestone broke the surface of the hillside above and offered its pale face to the rain. She had watched all of those things happen: the tree, the stream, the slow emergence of stone from soil, with the patient interest of someone watching a very long and very beautiful piece of work come gradually into being. She had no name, Pádraig said, that could be spoken aloud. Names, for beings of her kind, were not things carried in the mouth and passed between speakers. They were things carried in the land itself, in the way a particular hillside catches the morning light, in the sound a particular stretch of stream makes over a particular arrangement of stones, in the smell of a particular valley after rain. Those who were old enough and quiet enough to listen for such things, and there were fewer of them. even then, than you might imagine. Knew her by the way the glen sounded on a still evening, when the water ran low and the light came in from the west at that particular angle, and everything in the valley seemed, for a few moments, to be holding its breath. That was her name. Bridget said nothing. The workshop breathed around her, warm and close and full of the particular quality of attention that gathers in a room when something true is being told in it. She was, Pádraig said, choosing his words with the care of a man laying very fine stitches. The one who kept this place, not in the way a farmer keeps a field, or a lighthouse keeper keeps a light. In a deeper way. The way a heartbeat keeps a body. The way a root keeps a tree. Without her, and this was not something he said lightly, he wished that to be understood. Without her, the glen would have been merely a glen. A pleasant enough valley with a stream in it and a hawthorn tree and limestone on the slopes above. With her, it was this. He did not gesture around him. He did not need to. Bridget understood, with a completeness that settled into her like warmth settling into cold hands held near a fire, exactly what this meant. The quality of the quiet in the glen, the particular way the stream spoke, the feeling of being watched that the village people had always described. Not watched, known. There was a considerable difference between those two things, and it had simply taken the right word, and the right room, and the right voice saying it, for her to understand it. Tap, tap, tap. And the shoes? Bridget asked, very quietly. Pádraig looked at the pair on the bench beside him. In the lamplight, the hawthorn leaf pattern moved again, that gentle, barely perceptible movement, as if something breathed within the leather itself. The shoes, he said slowly, are for her. Bridget looked at the shoes, then back at Pádraig. But, she began. She is still here, Pádraig said simply. He picked up his hammer. She has simply, he considered the word with great care, been waiting. Tap, tap, tap. There came a time, Pádraig said, when the world began to change. Not all at once. It never happens all at once. It happens the way the light changes in the evening, so gradually and so continuously that you cannot catch the moment of it. You simply look up one day and notice that what was gold has become amber, and what was amber has become grey, and the blue has gone from the sky without your having witnessed its departure. And the day is done. The old beings, the first ones, the ones who had lived between the seen world and the unseen, began, one by one, and then in greater numbers, to withdraw. It was not a fleeing. He was clear on that point. It was not a defeat or a diminishment. It was more a deepening. The way a river deepens as it nears the sea, drawing its waters inward, becoming less wide and more itself. They went somewhere that had no geography in the ordinary sense, somewhere that existed in the same space as the world, but at a different depth, below the visible, below the nameable, below even the dreamed. Most of them went willingly, gladly, even. The world that was coming, louder, faster, more insistent in its demands on every surface it touched, was not a world they had any particular wish to inhabit. They had done what they came to do. They had shaped the deep nature of the land they loved, laid down in it something that would persist. He paused here and looked briefly at Bridget, long after they themselves had passed beyond reach. And they went, with the grace and the completeness of a tide going out. But she, the keeper of this glen, did not go. Pádraig set his hammer down again. He did this, Bridget had noticed, at the moments of greatest weight in his telling, as if even the small percussion of his work would be too much in the silence that certain words required around them. He looked at the shoes on the bench beside him for a long moment, his weathered hands resting open in his lap. She would not go, he said, because something held her. Not against her will. He was careful to say this, careful and deliberate in the way he always was when precision mattered, which was, always, not against her will, but because of it, because she had made, in the old time, a promise. The nature of promises made by beings of her kind, Pádraig explained quietly, was not the same as the nature of promises made by people. A person can make a promise and break it. A person can make a promise and forget it, or be forgiven for it, or outlive it. The promises made by the first ones were structural, the way the roots of a tree are structural, the way the bones beneath the skin are structural. They did not merely bind the one who made them, they became them, woven into the substance of what they were, as completely and as permanently as the grain is woven into wood. To break such a promise would not be dishonorable. It would be impossible. The promise she had made, Pádraig said, his voice dropping to something very quiet, was this: that she would not leave the glen, would not make the deepening journey that the others had made, until she had seen it safe, until she had seen the land around it in the care of those who would understand it, not merely live upon it, not merely farm it or fence it or name it on a map, but understand it in the old way, in the deep way, the way you understand a thing when you have been still enough, and quiet enough, and patient enough to let it speak to you in its own language, rather than the one you arrived with. And so she had waited through the long centuries of change, through the coming and going of the people above, in the village that grew up on the high ground and named itself after the valley below, through seasons beyond counting, through storms that flattened the trees on the ridge above and left the hawthorn standing, through droughts and floods and the long, slow, silent years in between. She had waited, present in the glen the way the glen's own deep nature was present, not seen, not heard, not felt except in that quality of the air on still evenings that the village people had always noticed, and never quite found words for. Bridget was very still on her small stool. The lantern above the workbench swayed its infinitesimal degree. The shoes lay between them in the amber light, their hawthorn leaf pattern breathing its quiet breath. "How long?" she asked. Her voice came out softer than she intended, as if the room itself had adjusted the volume of everything spoken in it to something appropriate to the weight of what was being said. Pádraig considered. He picked up his hammer, turned it once in his fingers, set it down again. "Long enough," he said, "that I was a young man, by leprechaun reckoning, when she first told me of it." A pause. "And I am not." He looked at his hands, those remarkable hands, with an expression of mild and long-acquainted irony. "A young man anymore." Bridget looked at the shoes again, at the extraordinary, impossible, perfect shoes, built on a last of ancient bog oak, stitched with thread waxed from a beeswax block given to him by a woman in Connemara who was herself, she now understood, part of a chain of care and intention that reached back further than she could follow it. "You are making them for her," Bridget said slowly, "so that she can." She searched for the word and found, to her own surprise, that she already had it, "so that she can go." Pádraig looked at her with those deep and quiet eyes. "Nearly," he said, and reached once more for his hammer. "Nearly." Bridget turned the word over in her mind the way you turn over something small and found and unexpected. A smooth stone, a fallen feather, examining it from every angle before deciding what to make of it. The shoes were nearly finished. The keeper of the glen was nearly ready. The promise made in the old time was nearly kept. Nearly. "What remains?" she asked. Pádraig did not answer immediately. He was working on the soul now, the final and in some ways most demanding part of the work, the part that would carry the whole shoe and determine whether everything above it held or failed over time. He worked it with a flat tool she had no name for, drawing it along the edge of the leather in long, slow strokes that beveled it to a cleanness she could see even from where she sat. The sound it made was different from the tapping, softer, more continuous, like the sound of a boat being drawn up slowly over smooth sand. "The shoes," he said at last, "still working, cannot be finished by my hands alone." Bridget waited. "A leprechaun's shoes," Pádraig continued, in the measured way of a man reading aloud from a text he knows very well but wishes to get exactly right, "are made for leprechauns, and the shoes of the first one." He paused, chose his words with great care. "Are not entirely the same kind of thing. They are made to carry a being who exists between the worlds, between the seen and the unseen, and for shoes that must bridge that." particular, distance. Something more than a leprechaun's craft is required. He set the tool down. He picked up the shoe and turned it in his hands, slowly, lovingly, with the full attention of someone looking at something they have given everything to, and which is almost ready to be let go of. Then he looked at Bridget. "They require," he said quietly, "the touch of someone who belongs to the world above, someone who knows this glen, not as a place to be avoided, not as a thing to be feared, but as a place that is known, felt, understood." He paused. In the old way. The workshop was very quiet. The lantern moved its slow amber light across the walls. From below, muffled and distant and beautiful, the stream continued its long conversation with the stones of its bed. Bridget looked at the shoes, at the hawthorn leaves worked into the leather, at the stitching so fine it was barely visible, at the sole beveled to that extraordinary cleanness. She thought of the glen above, of the way it had felt to stand at its edge for the first time as a small child, looking down into it from the road above, and feeling something she had never told anyone about because she had never found the language for it. Something that was not quite longing, and not quite recognition, and not quite the feeling of being called, though it was. She understood now, most like that last one. Something that had brought her, over all the years since, back to that road above the glen again and again and again, until this evening, when she had finally, and with the quiet decisiveness of someone who has been building toward a thing for a long time without knowing it, come down. "What do I need to do?" she asked. Pádraig reached across the bench and lifted the shoe, carefully, in both hands, and held it out to her. It was lighter than she expected, considerably lighter. She took it from him with both hands as he had offered it, and the leather was warm against her palms, warm in a way that leather left near a lamp might be warm, but also warm in another way, a way she could not account for and did not try to. Warm the way a living thing is warm. The hawthorn leaves on its surface were. She looked down at them. Moving. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have proven to a skeptic, but moving. The way leaves move in a breeze so light you feel it only on the finest hairs of your forearm, not on the skin itself. "Hold it," Pádraig said. "Just hold it, and think of the glen." Bridget looked at him. "That is all?" "That," he said, with the absolute simplicity of someone stating a thing that is, entirely, completely, and without exception, true, is everything. So Bridget held the shoe in both hands in the amber lamplight of the workshop beneath the hawthorn root, and she thought of the glen. Not effortfully, not with any particular intention or direction. She simply opened the door inside herself that had always been there, the one that faced in the direction of that valley and that stream and that particular quality of still evening air, and she let what was behind it Come forward. The warmth in the shoe beneath her hands deepened. That was the only word for it. It did not grow hotter. It grew deeper, the way a colour deepens when the light changes, becoming more entirely itself, more concentrated in its own particular quality. The hawthorn leaves on its surface stilled, not the stillness of something that has stopped moving, but the stillness of something that has arrived, that has found, after a very long journey, the exact place it was always travelling toward. Bridget held the shoe for a long, warm, entirely silent moment. Then she looked up at Pádraig. He was watching her with those deep and quiet eyes, and in them, for the first time since she had entered this warm and lamplit room, she saw something that was not quite any of the things she had seen there before. It was relief. The relief of someone who has been carrying something, alone, for a very long time, and has just, at last, been helped. He held out his hand for the shoe. She placed it back in his palm. He took it and looked at it, and she could see, even from where she sat, that something in it had changed. Something that had been waiting, was waiting, no longer. He reached for the second shoe and held it out to her. The second shoe was different in her hands from the first. Not in its making. The same extraordinary leather, the same impossibly fine stitching, the same hawthorn leaves moving their barely perceptible movement across its surface, but in its quality of waiting. The first shoe had felt like something that had been held in readiness for a long time, and was glad, in the way that objects can be glad, to be held at last. The second shoe felt urgent, not impatiently urgent, not anxiously, urgently in the way that the last note of a long piece of music is urgent, because everything before it has been building toward it, and the building is done, and the note is ready, and what remains is simply to sound it. Bridget held it as she had held the first, both hands, without effort, without intention. She opened that same interior door and let what was behind it come forward. The glen, the stream, the particular quality of the air there on a still evening, the smell of it after rain, the way the light came in from the west in the last hour of the afternoon and turned everything it touched. Briefly, breathtakingly, gold. She thought of the hawthorn tree above her, not as she had seen it this evening for the first time from close quarters, but as she had seen it all her life from the road above. A dark and spreading shape at the valley floor, unmistakable in every season, unchanged in every year of her memory, as permanent and as particular as the hills themselves. She thought of all the evenings she had stood at the road's edge and looked down at it, and felt that feeling, that unnamed, unhurried, entirely certain feeling. The warmth in the second shoe deepened, as the warmth in the first had deepened. The hawthorn leaves stilled, and then something else happened. the workshop changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way she could have pointed to and named. The lantern still burned its amber. The shelves still held their careful rows of tools and materials. Pádraig still sat on his stool before his bench, watching her with those quiet eyes. And yet, the room was fuller than it had been. Not crowded, not pressured. Fuller in the way that air is fuller after rain, charged with something invisible and clean and alive, as if something that had been hovering at the very edge of the room's perception for a very long time, patient as only the truly ancient can be patient, had moved very slightly, closer. Bridget held perfectly still. The feeling was. She searched for it and found it. The feeling she had always had on the road above the glen. That same quality of being, known. That same sense of something vast and unhurried and entirely benevolent, directing toward her. Its attention. But here, inside the room beneath the hawthorn root, with the second shoe warm and still in her hands, it was closer, more present, as if the distance between herself and the source of it, the distance that had always existed before, the comfortable and respectful distance of something seen from a high road, had been gently removed. She was not afraid. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all, that she was not, in any part of herself, afraid. The presence that had filled the room was the opposite of frightening. It was the opposite in the most complete and literal sense. If fear is a cold thing, this was warm. If fear is a tightening, this was a releasing. If fear is the feeling of a world that is too large and too indifferent and too little concerned with your particular existence, this was the feeling of a world that was exactly the right size and deeply, quietly, personally concerned. She placed the second shoe back in Pádraig's hands. He took it and looked at it, and she saw the same thing she had seen when she returned the first. That change, that settling, that quality of something, arrived. He held both shoes together now, one in each hand, and looked at them for a long and wordless moment. His face in the lamplight was, she would not forget this, the face of someone who has finished something. Not merely completed it, finished it, in the full and final sense, the sense that means not only that the work is done, but that it is right, that it could not be more right, that every hour of every day that went into the making of it was exactly justified by what it has become. He set the shoes down on the bench before him, side by side, perfectly aligned, and then he set his hammer down beside them, slowly and with a deliberateness that made the gesture feel ceremonial. And he set the beveling tool down, and the awl, and the wax, each one placed with care, each one in its accustomed place, each one done with, for now, in the way that tools are done with when the work they were made for has, at last, been completed. The workshop was very quiet. The presence that had filled it, that warm and ancient and deeply personal attention, was still there, still close, Bridget could feel it the way you feel warmth from a fire in a dark room even before you see the fire itself. On the skin, in the chest, in that place behind the breastbone where things that matter register. She did not look around for it. She understood, in some quiet and unquestioning part of herself, that it was not something you looked at, but something you looked from, something that was not beside you, or before you, or above you, but around you. All of it. Everything. Pádraig folded his hands in his lap. He looked at the shoes. He looked at Bridget. "Well then," he said. And in those two quiet words was everything. The end of a very long waiting. The completion of a promise older than the tree above them. The particular and irreplaceable satisfaction of a craftsman who has made, with all the skill and all the patience and all the long accumulated love of his ancient art, the finest thing he will ever make. Outside, in the glen above, the stream ran on over its stones. The stars had multiplied in the sky above the hawthorn canopy. The night air was very still, and somewhere in that stillness, in the space between the ground and the air, between the seen world and the world behind it, in the place where one thing is becoming another thing, and has not yet decided which, something exhaled. Bridget was the first through the little door. She went through it the same way she had entered, hands on the cool earth, head lowered, with the unhurried care of someone who has learned, in the course of a single remarkable evening, that this particular threshold deserves to be crossed with attention. She straightened on the other side and stood in the dark grass beneath the hawthorn canopy, and the night air of the glen came to meet her, cool and clean and carrying that deep, sweet complexity of smell that had been with the valley all evening, only richer now, the way everything is richer after dark, more concentrated, more itself, as if the night removes whatever dilutes things in the day and leaves only the essential. She looked up. The stars above the hawthorn canopy were extraordinary. She had seen stars all her life, from the road above the village, from the hill behind her father's house, from the long fields that ran down toward the western sea. But the stars above Carra Glen on this particular night were different, not more numerous, exactly, not brighter, exactly, but more present, more there, as if the sky above this valley had been polished, or cleared of something, or simply relieved of a weight it had been carrying for a very long time. Behind her, she heard the small sound of the door opening again. Pádraig emerged from beneath the root with a deliberateness that suggested this was not something he did often. He straightened beside her, considerably shorter beside her than he had seemed in the workshop, which made a kind of sense she did not bother trying to account for. And he stood in the dark grass, and he breathed the night air of the glen with the expression of someone breathing something familiar. Familiar in the deepest possible way. Not merely known, but part of. The way the smell of your own home is familiar. not because you noticed it once and remembered it, but because it is indistinguishable in some deep and unexamined way from the smell of yourself. He was holding the shoes, both of them, cradled in the crook of one arm, the way you carry something precious and, finally, completely, irrevocably, finished. In the starlight they looked different from how they had looked in the amber lamplight of the workshop. Simpler, in a way, quieter, as if outside, under the open sky, in the place they had been made for. They had settled into a final and resting version of themselves that needed no lamplight to reveal it. The hawthorn leaf pattern on their surfaces caught the starlight and held it, as they had held the amber light below, not reflecting it, but receiving it. They stood side by side in the darkness under the great tree, and the glen was very still around them, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The stream below ran on in its unhurried way. An owl called once from somewhere in the trees on the far side of the valley. A single long note, low and clear and carrying, fading at its edges into the surrounding dark. Then silence again. The deep, weighted, ancient silence of Carra Glen. Then the grass moved. Not in the way that grass moves in a wind, not from one direction, not in any wave or pattern that followed the logic of moving air. It moved from within, from some source at the center of the glen that had no physical form and cast no shadow and made no sound. A movement that spread outward through the long grass of the valley floor like a ripple spreading outward across the surface of still water when something, deep beneath it, stirs. It reached the hawthorn tree and the grass around its roots, and Bridget felt it across the tops of her boots and around her ankles. Not cold, not warm exactly, but present, aware of her, aware of Pádraig, aware, above all, of what he carried in the crook of his arm. Pádraig did not move. He stood with those remarkable hands loose at his sides, the shoes resting in the crook of his left arm, and his face was turned slightly, as if listening, the way a person turns their face when they hear their name spoken at a distance. Not hearing it exactly, but knowing, with a certainty that precedes and exceeds hearing, that it has been spoken. She knows, he said quietly. Bridget looked out across the dark valley, the long grass silver black in the starlight, the stream a faint and moving brightness below, the hills rising on either side in dark and rounded shapes against the star-thick sky. She could feel it, the presence, everywhere now, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, in the quality of the air, in some adjustment of pressure too subtle for the skin to name, but too unmistakable for the deeper senses to miss. The glen was gathering itself. That was how it felt. The way a person gathers themselves before a long journey. Not hurried, not anxious, but collecting, drawing inward the last and most essential things. Pádraig stepped forward, away from the tree, into the open grass of the valley floor. He walked, not toward anything she could see, but toward a particular point in the darkness of the glen with the certainty of someone who has known the coordinates of that point for a very long time. He walked slowly. The long grass parted before him and closed behind him. The shoes in the crook of his arm caught the starlight with every step. That same deep and receiving glow, steady and unhurried as a heartbeat. He stopped. He stood in the center of the dark glen, beneath the vast and patient sky, and he held the shoes out before him in both hands. And he said something, not in any language Bridget had ever heard, not in Irish, not in English, not in anything she had a name for. It was short, 4 words, perhaps, or 5, spoken quietly, without ceremony, in the manner of someone completing a very old and very simple transaction, the settling of a debt, the keeping of a word, the closing of something that has been open for longer than it was ever meant to be. The glen exhaled. Bridget felt it in her chest, that long, slow, complete outbreath, as if the valley itself had been holding something in for centuries, and was now, at last, letting it go. The grass stilled. The air settled. The stream below ran on, as it always had, as it always would. But the sound of it was different now, lighter, as if something that had been giving it its particular quality of weight and depth and ancientness was no longer there. Pádraig stood in the dark grass with his hands empty before him, looking down at them. Then he closed them, slowly, and let them fall to his sides. He stood like that for a long moment. The stars above him were very bright. The glen was very still. And Bridget, watching him from beneath the hawthorn tree, felt something move through her own chest that she had no name for. Something that was grief and gratitude and wonder, all wound together so completely that they had become a single thing. A single, quiet, irreplaceable thing. Then Pádraig turned and walked back through the long silver grass toward the hawthorn tree. And when he reached her, he stopped and looked up at her with those deep and quiet eyes. And the expression in them was everything she had seen there over the course of the evening. And one thing more. Peace. Simple. Complete. Absolute peace. They stood together beneath the hawthorn tree for a while. The old leprechaun and the young woman from the village above, in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together that neither of them will ever fully put into words, and who have arrived on the other side of it, at the kind of ease that usually takes a lifetime of acquaintance to reach. The night was deep around them. The stars were extraordinary. The stream below ran on in its lighter, cleaner voice, talking to itself in the way that streams do when no one is listening, which is to say, without any audience in mind, without any purpose beyond the pure and self-sufficient pleasure of running over smooth stones in the dark. Pádraig looked up at the hawthorn above them. Its canopy spread wide and dark against the star-thick sky. its branches moving the most imperceptible degree in some high and gentle air current that did not reach as far down as the valley floor. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has lived beside for a very long time, with a familiarity so deep it has passed through fondness and come out the other side into something quieter and more permanent, something that does not require a name. Then he looked back at Bridget, and in his eyes was that same expression she'd seen as he crossed the dark grass toward her. That simple, complete, absolute peace. And beneath it, something new, something that was, she thought, very close to gratitude. "You should rest," he said, "before you go back up." Bridget looked at the slope above her. Dark and steep and considerably less inviting at this hour than it had been in the golden afternoon light that felt, now, like something from another day entirely. She looked at the stream below, its sound rising through the still air of the valley with that new and particular lightness. She looked at the long grass of the valley floor, silver dark in the starlight, perfectly still now, moving neither toward nor away from anything. "Yes," she said. Pádraig nodded. That same single, final, entirely sufficient nod, and turned back toward the little door in the root. He paused at its threshold, one hand resting briefly on the dark wood of its frame. He did not look back. He did not need to. The gesture of that resting hand was enough. A good night said not in words, but in the weight of a palm against old wood, in the way a person touches something beloved and familiar, before stepping away from it, into the warmth and quiet of the place that is theirs. The little door opened. The amber light spilled briefly across the roots and the dark grass, and then the door closed behind him, and the amber light was gone, and Bridget was alone in the glen. She stood for a moment in the darkness beneath the hawthorn, listening. The glen was quiet, deeply, completely quiet. Not the quiet it had held before, that waited, watchful, ancient quiet. The quiet of something old and patient and present at every surface of the valley. The quiet that the village people had always felt and never named. This was a different quiet. Lighter, cleaner. The quiet of a room after a long and important conversation has reached its natural end. Everything said that needed saying. Everything heard that needed hearing. The air itself, settled. She made her way down to the stream. The ground between the hawthorn and the water was soft and uneven beneath her feet. Tufted grass and smooth stone and the occasional give of damp moss. And she picked her way across it carefully in the starlight, her hands out at her sides for balance, until she reached the bank where a long, flat rock ran out over the water's edge. Smooth-surfaced, wide enough, and still faintly warm from the day's sun in the way that certain stones hold warmth long after the light has left them, releasing it slowly and generously into the cool of the night. She sat, and then, after a moment, she lay back. The stone was perfect beneath her, warm and solid and absolutely still, the way only stone is still, with a stillness that is not the absence of movement, but the presence of something older and more fundamental than movement. The stillness of something that has never needed to move, because it has always been exactly where it is. She looked up at the sky above the glen. The stars impossibly numerous, impossibly bright. The dark shapes of the hills on either side framing them in long and gentle curves. And she felt the warmth of the stone beneath her back and the cool of the night air above her face, and the sound of the stream beside her running over its stones in that light and unhurried voice. And she felt everything and nothing. Everything that the evening had been, nothing that tomorrow required. Her eyes grew heavy. This was not a surprise. It was, if anything, the most natural thing that had happened in an evening full of extraordinary things. That a young woman who had come down a steep hillside in the late afternoon and knocked on the smallest door she had ever seen, and sat in a workshop beneath the roots of a great hawthorn tree, and held in her hands the most remarkable shoes ever made, and stood in a dark valley while something ancient and beloved completed its longest and most patient journey. That such a young woman, lying on a warm flat stone beside a quietly talking stream, beneath a sky full of stars, should find her eyes growing heavy. She did not fight it. Well, there was nothing here to fight. There was only the stone and the stream and the stars and the quiet of the changed glen around her. And from somewhere beneath the roots of the hawthorn tree above, muffled now and soft, but there, the sound she had first heard from the hillside above on a golden afternoon that felt, now, like the beginning of a story she had not known she was entering. Tap, tap, tap. Pádraig was working. Of course he was. The finest cobbler in the whole of the west of Ireland, beneath the roots of his great hawthorn tree, in his warm and lamp-lit workshop, with his tools set just so on the bench before him, and the beeswax in its tin, and the leather in its careful rolls on the shelves above, working as he had always worked, as he would always work, steady and unhurried and entirely, completely himself. The sound of it rose through the earth and through the roots of the tree and through the warm and quiet air of the glen and across the dark grass and over the smooth stones of the stream's edge and up into the still night. Steady as breathing, patient as water, old as the valley itself. Tap, tap, tap. Bridget's eyes closed. The stars remained above her, keeping their own ancient and unhurried watch. The stream ran on beside her, cool and clear and entirely without urgency. The hills held the valley between them in their long and darkened arms. And the glen, changed now, lighter now, quieter in its new and particular way, breathed around her with the slow and steady breath of something that has completed what it set out to do, and has settled, at last, into the deep and dreamless rest that follows. A thing, well, done. The tapping continued, soft soft and steady and warm. From somewhere beneath the roots of the oldest tree in Carra Glen. On and on and on, into the long and quiet dark. And if you listen now, very carefully, in the stillness behind your own closed eyes, you might just hear it too. Tap. 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 Sleep now. The glen keeps watch.